Seems like Samsung is throttling apps on the Galaxy S22 series of phones. Now, I talked about this when OnePlus did something similar, but I want to try something just a little bit different. Let's dig through some comments, replies, and hot takes. This stuff gets really complicated, and the reporting on it that requires some nuance. Whenever we throw around words like throttling, techies emotionally react, and that clouds the waters on the topic. I'm not trying to shame anyone, so please don't go hunting for arguments in the comments on blogs or the replies on Reddit. It's just kind of frustrating that the people who are most into tech seem to fall into this territory the most frequently. Okay, that disclaimer out of the way. Here we go. Throttling performance to improve battery life. This one's pretty common, but we're going a step above that now. When we see the newest Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 SoC in another phone, like a Motorola, when that phone's driven hard, it can reach temperatures of 60 degrees Celsius. That's 140 degrees Fahrenheit. We're not talking about a battery situation where we might need to recharge a little sooner than we wanted to. We're talking about something that might actually be uncomfortable to hold. Maybe we can just get apps that don't unnecessarily use a ton of resources and power for no reason. Seen a few comments like this too. I don't believe the apps are the problem. There's zero indication that from 2020 to 2022, mobile app development got so top heavy and so resource intensive that now our phones struggle to perform. Now, we should have a philosophical discussion about how modern CPUs try to maximize performance in a race to idle situation. They want to finish the task as fast as they can to get the phone to a lower power state. Totally get that. We should talk about it. But for the purposes of this conversation, I think it's important to consider the recent history of app development and SoC design. Have your mobile apps suddenly gotten more resource intensive? I don't think that's the problem with Samsung throttling right now. Remember when Apple did the same thing and everyone freaked out, but because it's Samsung, no one will care? That was a very different situation. But you heard throttling and you came running. Okay, Apple has been notorious for putting in smaller batteries on iPhones. And then as those batteries degraded over time, the iPhone could not sustain reliable performance. Apple's solution was to secretly throttle down CPU performance in subsequent OS updates, often heavily around the 2-year mark, where consumers would be looking at a new phone on a carrier deal already. No mention of this was made to the consumer. It was a problem that Apple created by including smaller batteries. So the consumer would just believe the new software was too hard for my old phone to run. There's that general perception that updates always tank your performance, because they did on Apple. And those consumers were not informed that a significantly less expensive battery replacement would return their phone to full working order. Considering the mountain of unnecessary phone upgrades Apple financially benefited from, I still personally rank this as one of the most anti-consumer business practices we've yet seen in the modern consumer electronics era. What Samsung is doing on brand new phones is keeping a secret list of apps that do not get the full horsepower of the SoC. Samsung is not slowing the whole phone down because of an inadequate battery. However, that sentiment of Samsung getting a different kind of reporting does have a ring of truth to it. When OnePlus did the same thing, we saw a rush of heavy-handed editorials posted. We saw Geekbench pull OnePlus listings from their benchmarking service. Now when Samsung does something similar, often there's a hint of, but OnePlus did the bad thing too, like that could be some kind of defense of Samsung. I'm just saying consistency in the reporting and the response to these types of issues would be kind of nice. Why doesn't Samsung apply the same throttling to benchmark apps? Advertising a level of performance that users won't actually get is scummy. This comment is totally spot on, and why the OnePlus version of this controversy was so complicated too. We need to point out that this is a little different than the last time Samsung was caught manipulating and juicing up their benchmarks. Back in the day, Samsung would keep a list of benchmark apps, and when the phone detected it was using a benchmark, it would light up a temporary tier of high performance to get a better score. The user never had access to that tier of performance on their other apps. Today, SoC manufacturers like Samsung and Qualcomm have designed chips that are very good at tiny short bursts of big performance. Get a huge spike of performance, return to idle. Spike, idle, spike, idle. No human really uses a phone like that when we're talking about sustained tasks. So why would we make chips that do that really well? I can't completely answer that question, but one aspect of this current SoC design, it does help you score way better on synthetic benchmarks. When we see those benchmarks, it's not one test. It's a series of micro tests that are all ranked and graded and timed, and then you get one big number score at the end. When OnePlus created a similar list, and I would imagine Samsung is doing the same thing, the list of apps are programs that likely don't need that top tier of performance or would run the phone so hot that it would actually compromise the user experience. I think it's fair to ask, do you need Instagram to launch a fraction of a microsecond faster, but also cook your hand at 140 degrees? Probably not. I mean, I get it. I understand why these lists are being created, but the correct answer should always be to enable the user to choose when and where they get access to all their power. You can let some users just go full autopilot, that's totally fine, but then give people like me a checklist where I can say, no, I actually do want that app to have full access to the resources of the phone. We shouldn't be creating secret lists that include many popular apps but exclude benchmarks. It was wrong when OP did it, and I was happy to see them correct that on Android 12. It's even more wrong when a market leader like Samsung does it. Samsung should not get less scrutiny than OnePlus. And it really sucks because I wish I could tell the phone, run Twitter, run Instagram, run Reddit from the lowest power cores on my phone. That kind of specific targeting would be awesome, but I digress. Samsung fans will make excuses for how this is different than Apple. Yeah, well, I mean, it is different. We kind of already covered that. How about offering consumers the option of prioritizing CPU performance over long-term battery performance and vice versa? The reason this move is so surprising for us SoC nerds, this is what Samsung was already doing. At least we thought. There's a battery setting on most newer Samsung phones that offers balanced or enhanced performance. Most techies aren't even aware that it's there. We saw a significant shift in real-world performance because of how the CPU scheduler worked in the battery settings. When OnePlus updated the 9 and 9 Pro to Android 12, they too include a battery setting that works kind of the same way. This battery setting is on the Galaxy S22, but in addition to that, Samsung is also including a list of throttled apps. Imagine the comments if it was Apple on the title they got crucified for doing basically the same thing. No, not the same. We covered that. Okay, same verb, to throttle, different application of that verb. No problem with this if it was clear how to turn it off for certain apps. And these kinds of comments, I completely agree. I actually agree with the purpose of this type of performance tuning, but I wildly disagree with the way that they've done it. I want to control this kind of performance throttling. I'd throttle so many apps. Oh yeah. And as this story is broken so far, that's about the gamut of replies and comments I've seen. Ultimately, I want the best consistent performance from a phone. We might get cranky that a OnePlus limits most games to 60 frames per second, but by keeping that performance ceiling, there are a lot of games that play smoother over longer periods of time. One of my favorite mobile games, a OnePlus just hovers in the high 50 frame per second frame rate, where a Samsung or a Xiaomi would spike and crash and spike and crash. And that's way more distracting. I'm not impressed by 2 seconds of gameplay at 120 frames per second if then my average frame rate drops to like 30 frames per second. And we get this when we talk about high-end desktops, gaming laptops. More GPU performance comes with more power draw and more heat, which leads to more throttling. Similarly, these throttling issues for end users seem to be derived from a similar idea of balancing performance against power draw and heat. These new phone chips are starting to approach the power consumption of Ultrabook style laptops, but they fit in your pocket. We keep looking at this arms race of better CPUs and better GPUs, and I think the whole industry could probably do with one off year to refine some of these designs. Maybe taking more stable core configurations, giving them a die shrink, and then updating them with new AI and coprocessor technologies. MediaTek's Dimensity 8000 might be a really interesting chip to watch for that idea, because when I see the performance charts on ARM v9 hardware, it makes me a little concerned. Taking a bar graph like this, the headline that specs junkies will write is, wow, this new X core is gonna deliver 10% more performance. But the disturbing part of that graph is watching the line swing up for 20% more power draw to get that 10% more performance. And if we could hang out for just 1 year, work with the handset manufacturers to better optimize, maybe deliver some better tools to software developers, we could get the same performance as last year at a lot less power draw. We could tune our phones to that, and I think we'd learn a lot. And lastly, I just want to leave off on the idea that these issues often aren't reported on consistently. It's my assertion that the bigger the company is, the more they should be taken to task for these kinds of practices. Just because they're popular and they sell well and your videos on YouTube get better ad revenue, we shouldn't go easier on the top players in the industry. When we normalize bad corporate behavior at Samsung and Apple because we're concerned about upsetting Samsung and Apple fans, that immediately trickles down to smaller manufacturers. Just because OnePlus did it first completely does not absolve Samsung of doing the same thing. And I also haven't seen a lot of follow-up reporting on some of the changes OnePlus has made. Really, there's no rational way to spin this where it isn't worse that Samsung copied a smaller label's dumb move. And that's gonna do it for me on this one. I hope we can engage in some healthy conversation on what pocket computers should be able to do and how we can get there. And I'll leave a link below on the Twitter thread that kicked off this whole discussion. I would highly recommend reading through that before just paging through the hot take headlines from some of these tech blogs. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch y'all on the next video.